Well, many of you are familiar with the pioneering work of Rosario Jackson, whose influential study, Investing in Creativity, has helped to guide, I think, the agenda of not only a lot of arts organizations, but nonprofit foundations. And we're eager to hear your presentation, Maria.
First of all, thanks to Sunil and Tom for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here with all of you. And what I'm going to talk about today is some work in progress. This is some work that is, in fact, revisiting some themes that came out of the study that Sunil just mentioned, which is a 2003 piece of work, the Investing in Creativity study. It was a study of support structure for U.S. artists. And specifically, I'm looking at the theme of what we call hybrid work. And the language is imperfect, but it's the language I'm using now. This is a piece of work that is funded currently by the Ford Foundation, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And I'm starting with two premises. And I should back up and say that I come at this not from the arts perspective exclusively, but primarily from an urban planning perspective, with a particular concern for comprehensive community development, urban revitalization, and quality of life issues. So it's through that filter that many of these observations I'm sharing with you come. So one is that artists and their work have a place in many facets of society and not exclusively in the conventional cultural sector. And secondly, that artists have multiple types of relationships with publics. And this expands our thinking about artists as people who are either exclusively the producers of artistic products, artistic widgets or goods, or performers for audiences. It is about thinking of artists as creative entities that have a range of skills and gifts to contribute in many different contexts beyond just presenting venues or dissemination venues for professional product. In terms of artists having multiple types of relationships with publics, I use the word publics because there's a tendency to default to the notion of audiences, artists and audiences. And it's a way of thinking about artists and their relationship to the world that I think undercuts what it is that they actually do and how they actually engage. So I think of artists having multiple kinds of relationships with publics that includes that audience participation and that artist-audience relationship or artist-collector relationship, but it also includes making, teaching, doing. So artists as social provocateur, as catalysts for amateur arts practice. So these many other ways in which artists connect to people. And what do I mean by hybrid? I've been looking at artists working at the intersection of arts and other fields and in places that are not part of the conventional cultural sector. And the other fields that I've been focusing on are community development, education, environment, and health. And the work that I've been looking at is work that helps artists meet their personal artistic mission. And I want to be clear that this isn't about a day job or you work at night to support your studio practice or what have you, or some arrangement similar to that. It's about a career or way of working that artists are asserting as creative people in all of it. It's not a separation. And that doesn't mean that these people can't have a studio practice and be involved in professional presenting venues as well, but the other kinds of work that they do, which is not in those realms, is also part of their artistic mission. So just quickly, methods. This is a work in progress, and the themes that I'll share with you are preliminary. We've done literature and web-based document review, and again, this builds on pre-existing work that some of you may be familiar with. In this round, we've done more than 140 interviews with artists and other people relevant to artists working at the intersection of arts and other fields. Focus group discussions in New York, Los Angeles, Miami, and New Orleans, and discussions with artists at various national meetings over the last couple of years. We've participated in 22 professional meetings and events where related topics have been treated, and some of these meetings are squarely within the arts field, and others are in intersecting fields, in health or community development and education. Field research has included artists in pretty much all disciplines, although the intention of this work is not to be a comparative study. We're not looking at dancers versus the visual artists or what have you. We highlight differences when they seem to make sense, but it is a more rounded approach. And the study also builds on another piece of work that is just concluding, which is research on training and professional development for visual artists that was supported by the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation, as well as the Arts and Culture Indicators Project, which is a long-standing project at the Urban Institute. That started with Jones support at the Rockefeller Foundation, and more recently with support from Leveraging Investments in Creativity. So we're drawing from several threads of long-standing work, even though the focus is specifically on hybrid work here. So what are the motivations for hybrid work? And I should start off by saying what we found in the interviews so far is that sometimes people intend to work this way from the beginning because of things that I'm going to talk about, and sometimes they end up there because the cultural market, if you will, couldn't support their ambitions, or for whatever reasons they weren't competitive within it. But some motivations for hybrid work are, one, the desire to be of service to communities and address specific societal concerns of issues, and again, often at the intersection of other fields. Secondly, the desire to connect to multiple and non-traditional publics and markets, so different kinds of audiences, consumers, but also students, amateur artists, other publics that they may want to touch or reach. And third, the desire to deal with problems outside of the arts field and be at the cutting edge of problem solving and invention and innovation, often in research contexts. And these things are not mutually exclusive. It's often one or some combination of these motivations. There are some contextual factors affecting hybrid work in recent years where we started the study in 2000, now almost 10 years ago. Holly reminded me that it's been almost 10 years since we did the original Investing in Creativity study. And there are some things that I think are a bit different now, and they, I think, affect hybrid work. And one is a heightened consciousness about creative economy and creative cities. Despite the economic climate, I think there is still a recognition that creativity is the global engine for a new economy. And that's recognized here as well as around the world. So that's one factor. Another is currently the austere economic context where artists are needing to be more resourceful and expansive in their thinking about where and how they do their work. Third is an expanded interest in innovation, technology, and environment. Another point is heightened interest in service and civic engagement. And last, a revival of interest in comprehensive approaches to communities and quality of life. And I'll say this from a planning perspective. Every 25 to 30 years, there seems to be a revival of interest in comprehensive approaches. And what typically happens is there's been some effort to more comprehensively address communities. There are intermediaries that are developed to build collaborations across policy areas and develop programs that are more soundly crafted around how problems and situations intersect with each other. That goes on for a while, and then people retreat back to their silos for lots of reasons. And I think we're at a juncture where people have retreated back to their silos, and there is now a revival of interesting comprehensive approaches. And I think it's an opportunity to assert and figure out how arts and culture might be integral to that and how artists might play a role in it. So these are some factors that I think in the last 10 years have become more salient. And I should back up and say that this notion of hybrid work is not new. I think many artists have been working in this way for a long time. I think that it is gaining momentum as the economy changes, as there are advances in technology and the climate changes so that there are more opportunities. But the notion of artists working in other fields, it's not new, but I do think we newly need to pay attention to it and figure out how to encourage and support it. Oh, wow, 2 minutes. So quickly, some challenges in supporting hybrid work. As Ruby mentioned earlier, the education, training, and professional development for this kind of work is still really scarce. And although there's progress in some areas, particularly in the identity of teaching artists, which is one of the most self-conscious kinds of hybrid work, and then some work in the health field, there's really very little, particularly within academic institutions, art schools, and universities that are preparing artists to either engage these kinds of fields, markets, or even think expansively about what they might do in them. Secondly, validation mechanisms for hybrid work are non-existent or poor fits from the arts perspective. If you think about the work of visual artists, often working in community, their work doesn't fit in a show. It's not something that fits easily into a gallery or can be written about in conventional catalog formats. Similarly, in the intersecting field, there's often little recognition for the fullness of what the artist is doing, both the aesthetic importance of the work as well as the other kinds of impacts that it might have at that intersection. Third, artists doing hybrid work report that they feel isolated and lack networks that can provide professional and moral support. So often you ask an artist, who are your peers? They can talk to you about who they collaborate to do an environmental piece of work or what have you, but when you ask them what other artists do you work with or deal with in order to advance your own craft or your own way of working, there's a bit of hesitancy about who they connect with or official mechanisms that enable that. Fourth point is that connecting artists doing hybrid work to employment and compensation opportunities can be really difficult. It's hard for artists to articulate what they have to offer in terms that the intersecting sector understands. And similarly, the intersecting sector is not especially looking at artists as a pool from which to draw talent. Determining proper levels of compensation is also problematic. So you've got this new way of working that doesn't really have a name and doesn't really have a salary scale that goes with it, and artists don't necessarily know how to negotiate something that is fair. Conventional thinking about art spaces and arts live workspaces and cultural districts don't necessarily jive with artists' needs when they're doing hybrid work. So you think about artist workspaces and art clusters, when in fact a scattered site might be something that is more interesting to artists that have a different intention. And I can go on about that, but I won't there. And then given current practices, the gathering of recurrent and reliable data about the number of artists doing hybrid work is even more challenging than gathering data about artists in more conventional arts careers. And I think the work that Anne has done through the crossover study is a big step towards beginning to get at some of this. But the kind of work that this particular study, I think is the necessary work that happens before you can launch into quantitative study about how many artists doing this kind of activity might exist. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Maria. Very good. You know, one of the things we had, we noticed around the heights, or really the depths of the recession earlier this year, was kind of how quickly a lot of arts organizations and funders mobilized to get data out there and to understand what the toll that the impact was taking on the recession was taking on their artists. So actually, Judilee Reed is going to present some of the data from LINC study. When was the study completed? Sorry. August. Okay, great. So this is another, I think, example of putting research to work here.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, I have 10 minutes, and this presentation is 9.8. So I'm going to try to stay on topic here. And I'm going to try to do two things. The first is give you just the very briefest overview of LINC, because I think it's helpful to hear about how our work is organized, and I think you'll very quickly see how we pull research and other information into the design and information that we provide. Is this one? Okay. And then the second piece of my talk will be specifically about some recent survey work that we've done with the Helicon Collaborative and with Princeton. So we can get started here. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, LINC, or Leveraging Investments in Creativity, is a 10-year initiative to improve artists' ability to make work, build social capital, and contribute to democratic values. Our work is defined by 4 programs. Our Creative Communities program, which is a program that offers local challenge grants to help communities address issues such as artist space, health insurance, healthcare, training and professional development, information infrastructures, and validation or direct support of artists. And I'm actually going to talk really quickly, so if anybody has questions at the end, or if you want me to just reiterate anything, I'm happy to, but I'm trying to stay within 9.8 minutes. Our second program, which has been renamed, is called Space for Change, and it's designed to support and promote culturally equitable and affordable facilities for artists where they might live and or work. Our National Artist Health Insurance Healthcare Initiative is implemented in close partnership with the Actors Fund, and this program connects artists with the information services they require to obtain affordable health insurance and healthcare. Artography is a funding and documentation program which we administer on behalf of the Ford Foundation, and this program revisions artistic practice through the lens of demographic change and democratic change. Research has played an important role in the design of these programs and in informing LINC's and its partners' decisions about how to best serve artists. And since our founding, based on the Urban Institute's Investing in Creativity study, we've worked with additional researchers, including Ann Markison, the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. We've done additional work with Rosario Jackson and her team and others to help us understand how artists navigate the resources available to them and ways that we can support that activity. Many of our grantees and partners use research as a way to build a case for their work. And this map just shows you the current grant-making activity that we're engaged in around the country. And I'll say a couple of things. It's hard to read, and I can actually send you this map so you can, if you're interested, spend more time with it. It's organized by the programs or the topics that people are addressing through their work. And everything in orange is our Creative Communities program, which enters into the survey that I'll be mentioning. But I wanted to say 2 things. First, that you'll notice that for those of you who are familiar with LINC, we started in 9 cities around the country, which was really based out of Maria's work at the Urban Institute, but we quickly spread out and started working with other types of communities, which includes the Northern Great Plains, where we focus our work with Native American communities. And we have also included communities in Alaska and Honolulu, also in addressing First Peoples issues through grant making and other information infrastructures. And see, I've digressed already. So let me switch over to the Artists in the Recession survey. First, this survey was conceived, implemented, and closed within about, I don't know, 2 months, 60 days, 65 days. It felt like 2 days. And the data that I'm going to present to you is actually the data that was collected between July and August. A second survey has just closed, which was one that we left open longer so that we could try to capture more artists' information. But what we were doing was a national survey of artists to gather information on the impacts of the recession to learn about artists' adaptive strategies and to identify primary needs and concerns of artists. We did this survey with the Helicon Collaborative and with analysis by the Princeton Survey Research Associates. And the methodology was interesting. We partnered with 35 service organizations to distribute the survey, and I think this was very important. Not only did we started with the organizations within our creative communities, but we also included important national organizations like Creative Capital, the Actors Fund, and others to help us distribute the survey to their lists. So this question or this conversation came up at the break where, you know, people get surveyed all the time. There's a lot of fatigue. But what we found was that going through organizations that actually serve artists in many important ways was a great way to increase participation. And doing this in a distributed way where we weren't asking organizations to hand us over their lists was another important factor in this. The survey was distributed to 75,000 artists, and we received over 5,300 completed surveys. The results were weighted, and again, as I just mentioned, we left the second survey, exact same questions, but with slightly different distribution protocols. We left that open until just this week so that we could capture artists who were not associated with the service organizations that we had initially contacted. And that survey, I think we have just under 2,000 completes, maybe a little less. So what did we find? And this, I think some of this data is actually interesting in comparison to some of the data that Greg offered this morning. Because remember that this was a survey that artists just got in their inbox, clicked on the link, and just, you know, and filled out, and it doesn't have the same kinds of perhaps filtering issues that the census does. Okay, so we found that 2/3 of the artists responding hold at least one additional job to their art making. And while designers and architects are most likely to have only one job, their art making, literary artists are the most likely to have one additional job. And choreographers, dancers, and performing artists are most likely to have 2 or more jobs. Musicians, in this case, Greg felt actually right below the architects, so they were actually fairly high in having a capacity to have one occupation. While the majority of artists in the survey have a college degree, 2/3 made less than $40,000 in 2008, and 43% of the artists report that less than 20% of their total income comes from their artwork, which for someone making $40,000 is $8,000 a year for their creative pursuit. Unexpectedly, artists who spend more than 80% of their time on their artwork have the highest income levels, while artists who rely on cobbling together an income from a mix of sources are most likely to earn under $20,000 a year. Years as an artist and the time spent working on art each week also positively influence the percentage of income earned from art. About half of the artists reported a decrease in their art-related income from 2008 to 2009, including 18% who saw it decrease by more than 50%. Artists who spend more than 40 hours a week on their artwork and depend on it for a higher percentage of their income are most likely to have experienced a decline in their art-related income, and that's no surprise. Some additional findings. 40% of those reporting do not have adequate health care. And among those reporting inadequate health care, we found, this is perhaps not surprising again, that about 45% of them have multiple jobs, and 37% derive all of their income from their art making. Internet use. We saw a high frequency of internet users. We saw that the folks who reported a high frequency of internet use are different from other artists in significant ways. They're younger, they're more optimistic about the future, and they're more involved in community activities offline. In other words, they volunteer both in and outside of the arts. Some other interesting facts about internet use were what they were going online to do, which included to network, and network really meant across a broad population. 41% of those reporting internet use Facebook, for example. They go online to locate information and services, and they go online to expand training and skills. Interesting was that none of the respondents cited selling work as an activity that they did often on the internet. The highest reporting was musicians at 37%, which was significantly higher than literary artists, who came in second at 28%. So we saw a underutilization of the internet in terms of a marketplace. Some opportunities. Oh gosh, oh no, I'm almost done. Opportunities, I'm gonna go very quickly. 40% report spending more time on their artwork. 1/3 of the artists are able to experiment more. Another third are experiencing more openness to collaboration. And 89% think that artists have a special role in helping communities during these times. 75% think it's an inspiring time to be an artist, which is really interesting. Some concerns. Not surprisingly, loss of income, rising debt, low morale, loss of health care. It's interesting, 40% don't have adequate health care, but 50% are worried about it. Some helpful resources. We asked folks what would be useful to you in managing through this time. Not surprisingly, grants and fellowships, showcases, networking opportunities, supplies and equipment, marketing assistance, and business counseling. Now, these concerns reflect the negative changes that artists reported, which include decreased sales and work, or a need to lower fees or rates charged for work. We also heard grant making for folks had been affected in a number of ways. There were more than 1/3 of the artists reporting a decrease in the monetary amount of grants available, the number of grants, the number of awards granted, and the number of grant opportunities available. More than 1/3 of the artists report that compared with last year, they have fewer bookings scheduled and fewer opportunities to exhibit, perform, or present their work. And about 3 in 10 say there are fewer services available by nonprofits, including 30% who cited fewer teaching opportunities, and 27% cited artist residencies in decline. And if you'd like more information, you can go to our websites. I just want to end by saying that this was one of the largest responses from a specific population that Princeton had gathered, the data that they had to gather and analyze, and their recommendation to us was to actually do more work looking at these very interesting data sets. So Helicon and LINC are talking about potentially mining a couple of topics or several topics over the next year, which would include looking at the employment patterns of the reporting artists, doing a lot more work on internet usage, because it's very interesting how underutilized the internet is for artists, doing some additional work on health insurance and health care, and then a workup on demographics, how long people have been an artist, how old they are, how much money they're making, etc.
Thank you very much, Judilee. Holly, did you want to say anything about, or any comments about this with Sidford? Okay. I mean, sorry, with your work. Okay. All right. So, any other questions, comments? Yes.
I just have a question for Judilee. 2 questions. You said 2/3 of the artists earned under $40,000 a year. Was this individual income, household income?
It was individual income.
Okay. And I assume it wasn't only from their art.
That's right.
Okay. And what was the median and mean age of this population?
The median age? I would have to look that up.
Okay.
I can send it to you. I'm sorry, my FedEx package didn't arrive, but I have actually summary reports for all of you from Helicon, and I'll just send them directly to you through the participant list, but it gives you much more information to that end.
Great. Angela, huh?
I just have a clarifying question for Maria. For those of us who are listening in who aren't familiar with the phrase hybrid work, could you give maybe a couple of specific examples?
Actually, when somebody I was talking to yesterday for a panel, there's a woman in Seattle, for example, Lorna Jordan, who does work on environmental issues. Her particular, she does large-scale sculpture, visual artist. Her work is in water treatment facilities. and turning those spaces through her art into places that the public has more access to. And it's also a teaching mechanism about environmental issues as it relates to water treatment and water as a natural resource. So that's a specific large-scale example. There are artists who are working in community settings, in venues as diverse as laundromats, clinics, doing their artistic work, which may not result in, say, a production at the end or a particular thing, but the work is about community engagement and that artistic process. So it's a combination of working outside of the traditional physical cultural environment that one may immediately default to, as well as at the intersection of arts and other fields. Is that helpful?
Well, I'll just follow up with that a little bit, and then I want to pose a question to both people. I just finished this wonderful study of Native American artists in Minnesota with a Native American partner, and many of the things that Maria is investigating in her work are really true of these Native artists. Some, for instance, use their artwork for ceremonial purposes in their community. They don't charge for it. Some of them don't charge at all. They just take what, because they have a tradition of giving. I mean, there's so many interesting issues about that are outside of our notion of the individual professional artist doing their marketing. At the same time, these are people who all want to make income from their artwork. It's very complex and interesting, so I'm so excited that you're doing this work. I wanted to ask both of you, you know, this is a stretch because it's beyond where you are, but one of the things that really strikes me about this period of time and about, you know, look back at the 30s also and what artists did is that, you know, we talk about a lot about what artists are suffering and we can do for them, but, you know, we know that almost 1 in 5 people in our whole workforce are unemployed right now. And one of the opportunities it seems to me that we have is to help artists figure out ways that they can, as your survey said, serve their communities. How can we use, you know, artwork as expression? I won't say protest, that would be a good word to use, but expression, you know, speaking to the suffering and displacement that people are going through, you know, using humor and helping to build solidarity. Are there, you know, in the works that you're doing, ways that we as researchers can learn something about that?
I think it's a really important question, Ann, and LINC actually just completed and will be announced in early December, the first round of its MetLife Innovative Space Awards. And I'm mentioning that because I think it's an important dimension of what you're discussing, which is looking at how spaces or the resources artists require to make their work can support the processes that they engage to make that work. So it's not as much an issue, I think, of asking artists to create a product that comments on something going on in our communities, but rather the important role that artists are already playing in helping us coalesce as a community and find ways of expressing what it is we're dealing with. And the spaces that are anchor points within these communities are becoming very lively spaces for these things to take place. And I hope that through the work that we're doing, through the work that other folks are doing around the country, we can lift some of those examples up and provide them as sort of, I hate to use the word case studies, but for this group, I think it holds up, kind of case studies that will help us understand what those processes look like and how they can be better supported.
Just quickly, I think in addition to some of the spatial considerations which Judilee brought up, those spaces where there is interaction between professional artists and amateur artists, or just people who want to exchange ideas, are where there's a lot of fertile ground for the kind of expression that you're talking about. But I think also in terms of new media and web-based platforms where artists are creating work, if you want to use that language, but they're also enlisting other people to provide content and really developing discussions and debates that are very relevant to our current climate. Those are important things to consider and look at. There's another project that is, I think, in the very early stages through the American Folklore Society and the Library of Congress that is about the redefinition of work. And it's looking particularly at folk and traditional arts. And I'm not completely comfortable with that language, but it's looking at that kind of work and the whole notion of work in the 21st century and redefining that with more inclusion of artists and what they do in nuanced ways.
Is that, Maria, do you know, is that an oral narrative like project, or how is that, do you know what they're?
It's still in formative stages. I think they're interested in developing a collection, which is what the Library of Congress is interested in. But I think they're expansive in their thinking about what that might include, and there is a sense that it should be useful to publics beyond just the art sector or the folklorists.
I think the work on the hybrid model is really exciting. I think has a lot of implications, especially for education. Your presentation got me to thinking about my work at the university and how students are crafting hybrid careers for themselves. As I ran the BA program in theater studies, and the students who wanted BAs as opposed to BFAs specifically didn't want professional training only, but they wanted to double major and also to have minors. So it would maybe be interesting to look at how students are double majoring and minoring. And what I noticed was that we had a lot of students going into law, political science, education, and medicine who were also theater majors. So I'm wondering, how in this economy, too, students are thinking about bringing those fields together. And so many of our BA students were telling us how they were using their theater skills, beyond the BA. And then also, I'm wondering if hybrid work captures those of us who have artists training who go into arts-related careers, which I think is what we're calling cultural workers, like arts administration, management, education. Is that a hybrid career, or is it?
It is of sorts. It's not what I'm focusing on in this particular study. And it was interesting because I think the first year of this work, so many conversations were about feeling out the contours of what we meant by that language. And for the purpose of this particular study, which has that overlay of urban planning and consideration for quality of life and community revitalization, the focus is really more on the intersections in other fields. And that's not to say that what you're discussing isn't important, but it's just not central to this particular piece of work.
I'm going to have to, I see one question in the audience. We haven't heard from the audience in a while. Can we just have that, and then we'll have to move to Nick at the next presentation. Thanks.
Hi.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Yasmin Ramirez. I'm from the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and I recently wrote a survey on the creative class of color in New York, and it's in the GIA reader, and it actually coincides a lot with the numbers that both Rosario and Ms. Reed presented. My question was about hybrid work, and you're finding that the more people have jobs, the less they make. How do we think about that? Because in some sense, it suggests that hybrid art workers, even they may have many talents, and yet they're not making as much as somebody who dedicates themselves up to one track.
There's a little bit of a distinction, I think, that in our survey, we were asking for the number of sources of income, and it kind of tracks that if you have 3 part-time jobs, you're likely to make less money in aggregate, you're less likely to have health insurance because you don't qualify for a group plan, et cetera, et cetera. Maria's work could actually, a hybrid artist under Maria's definition could actually have a single source of income versus many. Maria, do you want to pick that up?
No, I think you're completely right. There are lots of iterations in the hybrid work that I'm talking about, where, for example, at Kaiser Permanente in Southern California, there's a conservatory as part of the work that they do in terms of health education, and they are full-time employees of Kaiser. If you talk to them, they've got health insurance, they've got retirement insurance, they're in pretty good shape, and that program is sensitive enough where they're doing They're writing, they're producing, they're acting, and they have other projects as well. And the artists that I spoke to seemed fairly satisfied that their particular artistic personal mission was being met through that kind of employment, in some cases with additional projects, but certainly through that employment.
Thank you. I'm sorry, if we can get to the other questions in the next session. Nick, could you please, this is actually appropriate because he's going to be talking about a hybrid profession for artists, teaching artists, and we have, after that, Steve Tepper talking about another arts education-related workforce issue, which is really important. Thanks.
Thank you. And the Teaching Artist Research Project is being done out of Chicago, but we're studying artists in a dozen sites across the country. They're up there on the screen, and I'm going to go through this like a hot knife through butter, so they're gone now. And since you're wondering about hybrid professions or hybrid, I think it's interesting that I started out, I had a hunch there'd be some misunderstanding about what a teaching artist was. And I'm not sure I'm going to resolve that confusion with these definitions, but these are some of the definitions from the literature. I think the first one's interesting because she doesn't talk about a hybrid profession. She actually talks about entwined identities. She gets beyond this notion that these are either professions or just jobs. And the last one, Eric Booth is a major figure really in the world of teaching artistry, often thought of as the granddaddy of teaching artists, at least this generation of teaching artists. I was taken with Rocco's comments when he opened the session this morning about artworks, because I think he was referring very directly to exactly what Eric is talking to in this quote about teaching artists being the designated experts in the verbs of art. These are not necessarily the folks who make the work that goes up on the stage or the gallery wall. These are the folks that bring people into the process of the making of art, engaging them in a whole range of ways in new kinds of artistic experiences, and are kind of, in a sense, inventing new kinds of arts experiences and expanding the range of experiences that people have in the arts in America. Why are they important? Why should we study them? Well, they have made historic contributions. I could go on for the full 10 minutes about some of them, but I'll just tell you that Benny Goodman took his first clarinet lessons at Hull House in Chicago, and he was taught by teaching artists. They are, without any question in my mind, the source of vital innovation and new practice in both the arts and education today. And they're an essential element of any strategy to expand arts education in the United States, and there are major cities all over the country, despite the recession, that are thinking very hard about how to do that, and for that matter, despite current educational policy about how to do that. What do we want to learn about in the study? We want to understand teaching as a component of artists' work life. We want to know who these folks are, and we want to know what they do. We want to know about the terms and conditions of their employment and establish a baseline. We also want to understand teaching artists as an element and resource within the larger infrastructure of the arts and education, and how to understand better how to support their work and develop them as a resource in that infrastructure. Mixed methods, that's quick. This is how the artists who've responded to the survey have broken out. We have the largest portion are visual arts, but you can see we have a pretty good distribution across all art fields, including newer art forms like the media arts. And we included literary arts in the study. The first artists that sort of that moved into the school settings in the 60s were the Poets in the Schools, sponsored by sent there by the NEA. Give you an idea about educational attainment. It looks like it's a little higher than artists in general. 50% have master's degrees or higher. And most of the degrees are in an art form. Who do they work for? The majority work for nonprofit arts organizations, but again, you see that there's a distribution across a number of different kinds of employers. Who employs them and where they work are often different things. They're sent out, and 35% of the work that they do is in K-12 schools. Just to give you an idea of how important that might be, Boston did a study, not my data, Boston did a study that indicates that as much as 40% of the arts instruction in Boston public schools is delivered by teaching artists now. I want to point out that there is a historic tension around the work of artists going into schools. It's a major policy issue, to be quite honest. A prior NEA director wrote a story about how his first experience on coming to Washington was actually to be called to a meeting with the leadership of the MENC, the National Association of Professional Arts Music Educators, the purpose of which was to convince him to stop making grants to send musicians into schools. But in addition to schools, there's an enormous diversity of other sites in which these artists work, from prisons to hospitals, from parks to senior centers. This is actually a surprising slide. I did not expect to see the level of experience. People stick with this work. You can see half have a decade of experience. Pay rate was, again, a bit higher than I anticipated. The problem, as you would expect from the earlier presentations, is the number of hours worked. 69% are women, median age 44. So clearly, teaching artist is sometimes, I shouldn't even say often, is sometimes a first job in the field, but it is certainly not just an entry position. Their biggest problems, this aligns really quite well with what Judilee just presented. First on the list was lack of benefits, especially health. 20% have no health insurance. Just 4% of them are covered by health insurance through their work as a teaching artist. Many of them, of course, are covered by through other jobs or through spouses. They earn too little. This should be median income. It's a typo. From teaching is about $17,800. Total personal, not family income, is about $36,000. They don't have job security. There's no career ladder. Where do you go from here? A few of them become managers of programs that hire teaching artists, but that's about it, and where they go from there. And another issue for these artists is there's too little time left for them to do their own art. But why do they teach? Well, first, because they want to work in the field that they love. Second, because they actually find that they love teaching. They pass on a gift, and it's worth sort of underscoring the word gift because it speaks to this issue of the complexity of the work. It's not a transaction that's strictly about money. They want to contribute to social and community change and development. It speaks very much to Maria's findings. And they also find that teaching contributes to their growth as an artist. Most of the training for this work is informal. Some colleges and conservatories are just now starting to offer some classes and programs. Most of their important professional development comes from on-the-job experience and their education in the art form. But 50% report that they were really utterly unprepared when they started the work, and they it was trial by fire. I was surprised and somewhat disappointed to find that many of them feel that the workshops and professional development that are offered by arts organizations are not particularly valuable. Why do they teach? It's very similar to why they got into the field to begin with. Who do they teach? Skews heavily toward young people. The two big policy questions that I think are raised by the study at this point have to do with the nouns and the verbs of the arts. Arts organizations privilege the nouns. You can tell that because the education offices are usually in the basement. There's some question about whether there needs to be a better balance. There ought to be a better balance between the nouns and the verbs of the arts. And the second big question is, because so much of their work is in schools, is there a way to reconcile this historic tension between what we usually refer to as arts specialists, the certified art teachers and music teachers, and the roles that artists play in schools? I just thought I'd end with a photograph of two kids who were by a teaching artist in a Chicago school. Just so you know, this is real stuff.
Thanks a lot, Nick. I regret that our arts education director, Sarah Cunningham, couldn't be here today, but she I know would have a lot to talk about that subject, have to say on that subject as well. And also Sarah would know that our next speaker, Stephen Tepper, is going to be talking about a project that the NEA funds right now. And just to give you a sense of the agenda again, Stephen's going to be talking, and then we'll have Q&A, and that'll last us till 12:30, and then we'll break for lunch. All right, Stephen.
Sunil, I'm curious to know who got the extra time.
Well, yeah, well, I'm just kidding. Trade secrets.
I want the audience to wonder, maybe it's me.
It was somebody who lobbied. I think lobbying is that's the only form of lobbying we can transact.
So I don't know who has it worse, Ann or I, on the last speaker before lunch or the first speaker after lunch. We can fight that out. I'll also say there's a cultural script that individuals do better than government, or more efficient or effective. And I have to say, in terms of planning for a meeting, the government does better than individuals, because Tom asked me 3 weeks ago for my PowerPoint presentation, and let's just say it wasn't finished. So a lot of what I'm going to say is not on the slides, so bear with me. The Strategic National Arts Alumni Project is an annual online survey, data management, and institutional improvement system designed to enhance the impact of arts education, art school education. We are surveying alumni of arts high schools, independent art and design colleges, conservatories, art schools, and departments within comprehensive colleges, two-year colleges, and we're surveying alumni who are 5 years, 10 years, 15, and 20 years out. The project is supported by the National Endowment for the Arts. The lead funder is the Cerna Foundation, and there are other funders. I won't mention them all. As articulated by our National Advisory Board, here are some of the goals of this project. To clarify the core preparation that arts institutions should provide, and especially in light of what graduates actually experience in the marketplace. To helpfully illuminate what one advisor said, the high goals and life skills that are provided through arts training, but which are not typically specified in the curriculum itself. To help interrogate claims that training institutions make about the efficacy of the training and education they provide. To help institutions address the needs of underserved teens and underrepresented racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups within arts training institutions. To abet curriculum reform efforts carried out among tenured faculty at these institutions by providing direct feedback from alumni about what's working and what isn't working. Importantly for these institutions, to provide peer comparisons, illuminate pipeline and mission-related questions, and also to help organizations and these schools in particular address the needs of artists over the full trajectory of their lives, and not just while they're in school. All of the institutions we've worked with really see their role as intervening and supporting at multiple stages in an artist's life. Provide the basis for a collective national response to challenges facing arts institutions. So this is really about workforce preparation and it's driven by the interests and needs of the institutions that train artists in multiple capacities. That's where this survey emerged and developed. I think it can help answer other broader national policy questions, and today's conversation will usefully inform what those questions can be. The rationale for this, again, the demand came from the schools themselves. There are, well, I'll tell you how many schools have participated to date. You know, we all hear guesstimates about how many graduates actually get jobs in the fields they're trained in. You know, in conservatories, I've heard 5%, maybe 10% high. The truth is, schools have absolutely no idea how many of their graduates even work in the arts. It's just a huge gaping hole of information. I think there's also scholarly interest in this work. One of the issues we face for those of us who study artists is what we would call sampling on the dependent variable. That is, we only study artists. We don't study those people who were trained to be artists that went on to other careers, because our samples don't let us do that. By sampling students that trained to be artists, some of which became artists and some of which didn't, we can finally ask some really interesting questions about what were the factors that led to one pathway or the other. And as far as I can think, this is one of the few ways that we can develop a sample that has both kinds of individuals in it. I also think there's policy interest in there. Certainly policy interest from the schools themselves and how they can leverage their resources better in their curriculum to help artists. But I also think as we talk about the creative workforce, the changing nature of our economy, you know, we may be at a time that science and engineering was 30 years ago. Many people know that you know, the National Science Foundation Act of 1950 actually had a statutory charge for the NSF to be a central clearinghouse for the collection, interpretation, and analysis of data on scientific and engineering careers. In '73, that was amended to lead specifically to the development of a survey of doctorate recipients. And that has been a panel study over the last more than 30 years, and to the publishing of every 2 years, this is again mandated by Congress, of science and engineering indicators. And it seems to me that this project is a beginning effort, along with I think a lot of the other research in the room, to perhaps say it's time now to have a regular reporting of the state of America's creative workforce. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. I hope we can return to it later in the discussion today. So what we've done to date, we had a field test in 2008. This is a screenshot of one of the survey pages. It's not very pretty. We surveyed 23,000 individuals from 40 institutions. Of those, this is an exclusively online survey. Now, we have found that this is a real problem in terms of getting good email addresses. The schools only had 13,000 email addresses of the 23,000 graduates we were trying to survey. Of the 13,000 people that had email addresses, about 12.6% completed the survey, and another 10.9% were partial completions. A total of 1,739 graduates across those 40 institutions completed the survey. Those are reasonably low response rates. They're similar to what LINC got. 20% of those email addresses are just bad addresses. They got bounced back. And then over 50%, 54% never responded, and we don't know what's wrong with those people. They either didn't want to respond, or we don't have the right email address. Lots of people have 4 or 5 or 6 email addresses. They don't go back and check, so we don't get bounce backs, but we're presuming that we're not sending these to the right people. We sent postcards to the other 10,000 people who didn't have email addresses, to no success at all. Less than 1% of those people who got postcards went online and took the survey. So survey methods are changing. We're learning a lot. Here's some interesting findings from that survey, and some of these are similar to what you've heard already, and some of them are really different. So it's interesting. I think we can all triangulate our results and see why they're different based on the different kinds of samples that we're pooling. Professional artists are more likely to hold multiple jobs. We found that 58% said they had three jobs simultaneously. That's a lot. But those who were not professional artists had 42% of them had more than 3 jobs simultaneously. So artists are just canaries in the mine for much bigger transformations in how we work, this new sort of entrepreneurial economy. Interestingly, this is counterintuitive, the older cohorts, 20 years out, had more multiple jobs and were more likely to be working in contract and self-employed positions than the younger cohorts. And I guess that could be because their networks are more mature, which gives them the ability to have successful entrepreneurial careers. There may be other theories I'd be interested in hearing. Networks obviously play a really important role for these graduates. 35% said they're satisfied with the network opportunities they have now to advance their careers. 28% said this is the greatest barrier to their professional advancement, the lack of networks. Interestingly, and maybe this goes against some of our policy assumptions, only 15% said a lack of grants was a barrier to their artistic career. These graduates aren't necessarily assuming that they should receive grants or that those grants are critical to their career advancement. Well over half of the graduates have taught art at some point in their lives. So that is consistent with Nick's findings. It just gives you a sense of the context of how many of these graduates actually teach. And of course, we know most of the schools don't offer that in their curriculum. So they are learning on the job. These graduates are extremely satisfied with their arts training. About 95% said they're satisfied or very satisfied with the arts training they got. But they're very unsatisfied with things like training in communications and leadership. Only 37% were satisfied in that. Only 3% were satisfied with the amount of training they got in financial matters and management. And that's notable given that 34% of all arts graduates working in the arts report that they started their own business at some point in their artistic lives. They say they need more time to do their work. A quarter of them, and this goes with some of the findings that Maria has shown over with her earlier work, that they're looking for opportunities to present their work in important venues, even more than financial and economic opportunities. They just want their work to be heard, to be seen, to be validated. 50% said that their student loans have influenced their career choices. And importantly, 44% who are not professional artists continue to practice. 44% of those who are not professional artists continue to practice their art. We can debate whether that's a lot or a little. So half of those that were trained as artists have given it up. And many of those that are working avocationally, I think an important part of the survey is that we get a chance to understand the needs of those pro-ams, or those people who could be professional artists, but they're not working in that capacity, but for whom their artistic lives are still important. They say they don't have access to the mentors that they need. And they also don't feel like they have access to present their work publicly. 41% said that's a challenge for them. 2 minutes. I guess I've just... Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the institutional reports that have been generated from be extremely useful in spite of what I would say the bad data at this stage, because we don't know what our response bias is. They're already beginning to use these reports in faculty meetings to plan. This is some screenshots from those institutional reports. This is the newly designed survey that's been fielded in the last week. It's gone out. And this is going to alumni of 54 institutions. So between the 2008 and 2009 field tests will be about 90 institutions that have participated. It looks slightly better. I think we could still do a little bit of design work. I'll just spend the last 30 seconds telling you about one feature of this project. From the beginning, we've known that it's very hard to ask artists about their careers, and they certainly don't like checking boxes, and they have very complicated careers, and they get very frustrated taking surveys. So we thought about a way to include a life map in how they answered questions. In fact, at one stage, we got rid of the questions, and we thought the entire survey could be driven by a life map, and it was too complicated. So we went back to a survey, but now the survey self-populates elements on their life map, where they've gone to school, important people in their lives, important transitions and barriers, important jobs and opportunities. And this is populating as they're taking the survey. And after the survey, if they still have any energy left, they can go in and manipulate this life map, making some things more important, making connections between things, adding things to their life map. here's where I really think the opportunity for the life map lies. Some people will go back in and do this. These are conversations that I personally had with two artists. This is Mila Churchill, who's a playwright, screenwriter, and filmmaker. And I spent about an hour and a half on the phone with her. And the entire interview was done as an interface with this life map. So we worked on it together, interactively, online. The blue things are job opportunities. The yellow are training. The green are green are job, blue's opportunities. Anyway, red's barrier. We can talk about this later. But the point is that the method was extremely useful for helping them conceive of their lives. And they made all kinds of connections while we were talking that they probably wouldn't have made if they were just answering a survey. They started moving things around, making something central, putting other things in the background. It was really an exciting process. This is very difficult to analyze. We haven't figured out how we're going to do it. But I think a wonderful opportunity really would be to train current students of these alumni at these institutions to interview their alumni, both as a way of career development for themselves, but also as a way to produce hundreds of these life maps that we can begin to analyze more rigorously. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer questions in the next 20 minutes. Oh, here's the other life map.
Yeah, I have the pleasure to see Stephen conduct the interviews that form some of the life maps, and it's really a fascinating process. And from what I could gather, the interviewees seem to enjoy it. So it's like therapy almost for you too, maybe. So any questions? I want to hasten to point out that I know it seems like you're maybe drinking out of a fire hose right now. You're hearing a lot of presentations, but we will be trying to tie things up or sculpt this in some form throughout the day, and later on we'll be assisted by Holly and Paul to kind of help generate some ideas coming from all this for moving forward. Good luck, right? Perhaps you should. Randy?
Yeah, thanks for two more very interesting presentations. Stephen, were there many observations of differences between the more recent graduates and the folks who've been graduated, been out of school longer, that come to mind anyway?
Surprisingly, this is not substantive, I'm sorry, but we actually had better email addresses for those older cohorts, which, on the one hand you would say, well, they're not online as much. On the other hand, they're not moving around as much. So, but
Why would that matter for email?
I think young people set up multiple email addresses depending on what social circles they're in, and they leave them behind quickly. But in terms of substantively, I mean, there's a lot more work to be done. I will say that we did some very shallow analysis, knowing that we don't understand the response bias. I mean, and what I mean by that is we don't know whether people who feel like they've had successful careers are going to be more likely to want to answer the survey. And what I didn't get to say is in the 2009 field test with the 54 additional institutions, we're putting in all kinds of tests to look at whether if we can get the response rates up for a control group to a pretty high level, either by offering financial incentives or by calling them on the phone, by doing every method we can to get the information in, whether if we look at the demographics and the characteristics of those two samples, whether there's any difference. And if there is a difference, we have to figure out how to adjust for that. If there's not a difference, then we can probably go forward with some smaller, some low response rates. But just an answer, we haven't done a lot of analysis because we don't really trust the data yet.
The question's for Steve, and thank you. I'm really happy to see that this is happening. When you try to capture either the life maps or the more conventional survey, is there a way to account for those kinds of artists that are working outside of the cultural sector? Say an artist that is employed in a parks department, or the teaching artist. Is it possible to do that currently?
Yes, we ask a number of filter questions, but one thing we're looking at is whether you self-define as a professional artist, whether you work avocationally at your art, whether you work in an arts-related profession, Now, how people define, if they're working at the Park Service as an artist in some capacity, whether they consider that arts related or as an artist, we haven't been able to tease that out. But those people are certainly in the sample, and they do produce life maps.
I wanted to ask about the folks who are the public school art teachers whose professional identity, at least for the moment, is teaching, and to see if we know how different they are from people on the other side, because I'm curious about, how are they trained in the arts? Are these folks who in the summer are actually performing for money or making art, earning some income from art? Are they folks who in 2 years might not be public school teachers anymore, but might be more in the role of artists earning money through teaching in some way?
Sadly, Paul, it's a study of teaching artists, not of art teachers. So I don't have a database answer to your question, but I can certainly say that my experience is that there are significant differences, and that it's probably important to understand what the differences are. And at this point, I have a whole range of hypotheses about them, but I can't back them up. The largest, from my perspective, I think the most interesting avenue to pursue, though, is the ways that teaching artists think about their teaching practice as art practice, as opposed to the teaching practice of certified art teachers who think of it as an educational practice. Now, this is one of those Venn diagrams, I think, that David was recommending we do. And there's a spectrum of practice across. And the teaching artists sort of lean heavily on the side of art practice. The art teachers lean a little bit more heavily on the side of educational practice.
You will be hearing music in the background. That's from the food court area, just so you know. And there's some questions in the audience. Actually, David has had his hand up for a while. You sure? Please.
Hi, I'm Barbara Davis with the Actors Fund. We, in our employment and training program, which helps people in the arts develop sideline and parallel careers, teaching artists is a very important and popular thing for people to do. And we've been running training programs in Los Angeles and New York. What we've found this year is that the number of jobs opportunities has dropped dramatically. It's like right off a cliff. In terms of working with the school systems. We're making it up a little bit in after-school programs, but there's a big difference in terms of the amount of hours you can get and the salaries of working in an after-school program versus something, in the public school system or the education system overall. Have you seen any statistics? Is anybody looking at the numbers of the change that's happened in the last year or so with this?
Judilee may actually know more than anybody else in the room about that, but she's not specifically studying teaching artists. But my study is kind of capturing things as they are fairly currently. But certainly, we've got lots of anecdotal evidence that jobs, we know about what happened in Los Angeles of late, and where almost all the arts partnerships in LA USD schools were eliminated completely, so a lot of artists lost their jobs. But on the other hand, there are trends and counter-trends. It's kind of stunning how many of my study sites where there are very serious initiatives going on to expand arts education even in this climate.
Others in the audience? Yes. Sorry, you can't see you there. Sitting behind Barry, our Director of Folk and Traditional Arts. You were raising your hand? Oh, there. Oh,
Hi.
Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly Barsdate from the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and thank you both, actually everybody, for giving really high-octane 10 minutes at a time. This has been really valuable. I did have a follow-up question for you, Nick. One of the things that you mentioned in your review was that teaching artists reported that they found professional development and training and workshops a little less important or less influential in their growth as teaching artists than some other forms of experience and training. And I wondered if you can unpack that a little bit. Can you add anything about why or how so?
Again, I'm so sorry that I'm in the middle of the study, and we're starting to do interviews, and we'll ask questions about the why. But actually, I have a hypothesis, and I refer back to the literature on professional development. The approaches, the strategies for professional development that arts organizations often use are simply not best practices. A workshop, a workshop for a day, or even a weekend's worth of workshop is no substitute for sort of ongoing, systematic, professional engagement and the building of a professional community. I think I have a hunch that's why we see the kinds of responses that we did in the survey.
Yes. Could you say I forgot to say, if you could say your name and what your affiliation.
Ian David Moss with Fractured Atlas and blogging with creativity.com. So I have a question related to the hybrid artist discussion from before, but the teaching artists you mentioned were kind of part of that group, so hopefully it'll sort of apply across. And my question is, so when we've been talking about these kinds of categories of artists that are on the fringes, kind of compared to their cousins on the more sort of professional, full-time side of things. And one theme that seems to be coming up a lot is that they're undercapitalized, they're not making a lot of money, and it seems like that a lot of that probably has to do with the organizations that they work for or with are undercapitalized. They, are grassroots organizations. They're not getting the same kinds of, big donations that, the Symphony Orchestra and the Art Museum are getting. So from a sort of philanthropic perspective, there's kind of an easy solution to that if you're in a position to do so, which is just to, pump some more money into that field. But my question is, for this kind of hybrid artist work, is there a sense, either from the data or maybe more likely just kind of intuition, of what kinds of benefits this kind of, sort of on the maybe closer to the ground or more on the fringes type of arts work, what benefits there are to communities and society that can't be, gleaned from the more traditional kind of, art as presentation and performance type of work?
I think there were several things you brought up. I'm going to focus on the last part that has to do more with, I think, a discussion of that people like to talk about as impacts of certain kinds of arts practices, and from not so much this particular piece of work, but from previous research specifically on artists in communities. I think there's a tendency to want to make for the arts field to want to make the economic development argument or the economic impacts argument, and it's a good argument to make. My criticism of the ways in which it has happened often is that I've said this in many other contexts, you expect presenting institution ka-ching, and it's that kind of framing of arts impacts when the community-based practices are more about engaging people in creative process. You see outcomes that are more related to stewardship of place, place making, things that have to do with leadership development or the cultural capital, if you will, of people, of citizens, not necessarily professional artists. And there's still a way to get into the discussion or the argument about economic development, because oftentimes the kinds of impacts that kind of practice renders are preconditions for economic development. some work that one of our Arts and Culture Indicators project partners is doing in Chicago, the Metropolitan Chicago Information Center. There they took a look at amateur arts practice in a number of different Chicago neighborhoods, and they found high correlations between high incidence of amateur arts practice and other favorable characteristics of community that had to do with tenure in neighborhood, people wanting to be there, and they started to call that magnetized neighborhoods. And one of the elements of a magnetized neighborhood was this high incidence of amateur practice. Now, there's a connection to professional artists there too, because often they are catalyzing that kind of activity or somehow involved in making that possible in these places. So that, I think hopefully that addresses some of the issues related to the impacts piece.
Ruby, that was a first.
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned. I want to clarify that I don't think that hybrid career artists are on the fringe. I think that they're actually more fully integrated with civic participation and with the development of communities than lots of other types of artists. There's a project in Ajo, Arizona that I like to talk about that's by the International Sonoran Desert Alliance, which is really placing cultural practice at the center, literally, physically, and kind of conceptually at the center of this small, formerly mining town. And when you look at how deeply woven the practices of this organization and the artists in it are with the daily life experience of the broader community, it becomes very clear that it is much more engaged and much more integrated with that community than perhaps an artist who, might be isolated in a studio and just moving paintings to market.
I just want to echo that because I think far from marginal, this is really a burgeoning area. I think it's actually where the future is. And we've had a category of work from the very beginning that we called emerging fields, to have a place where whatever new practices were emerging could have a home. And it's been remarkable to see the work that people have done over time on really the kind of central issues, I believe, of our moment. For me, one of the things that's missing, and that I think there's just such an opportunity to move all of this kind of work forward, is that we're not seeing a lot of cross-sector convenings. So there aren't that many opportunities for social entrepreneurs and cultural entrepreneurs who are working on some of these same issues, whether it's immigration or criminal justice or the environment, to really come together, I think, to sort of collectively advance the interests of those issues. And that's really an area that doesn't seem like it would be that hard to begin to affect, both at a governmental level and certainly in the private sector through a number of the philanthropies that support work going on in culture and work going on in many of these other areas.
I just want to comment on the fringe issue, because I really agree with Judilee that in lived experience, artists doing hybrid work are often much more integrated into everyday life. It's not about going to a performance as a special occasion so much as it is about some other aspect of life that is much more integral to the day-to-day. And in that case, they're not on the fringe. However, in relation to what Ruby is saying, I think both in the arts and in the intersecting fields, in terms of validation, they are on the fringe. Because when you think about the traditional validation mechanisms within the arts, it doesn't typically include people doing hybrid work, and your program is an exception. But it doesn't typically or automatically assume that kind of work is integrated. And similarly, in the intersecting field, a lot of those instances where artists are doing work in transportation or in environment or in education or what have you, they're kind of doing it on the down low. And the intersecting field may not even be completely aware of the gifts being brought to bear in their environment because they're code switching. They're talking about themselves in different ways. even though their practice may be very much that of an artist.
I can't agree more with Maria's point, and I want to speak to it with regard to teaching artists, particularly in schools, because partly there's a culture clash that goes on when artists go into schools. These are not folks who are particularly interested in most of the dominant trends in school policy. You know, how are we going to contribute to raising reading and math scores? And in a certain sense, they're not even that as interested in, and this speaks to your question, Paul, in teaching the craft skills of art in the scope and sequence order that the master curriculum says that needs to be taught. They're interested more in questions like, gee, how can we help kids develop their personal expressive voices? That's a very different question, and so they're working in a mainstream institution, but they're on the margin of that institution.
If I could, I'd like to pick up on teaching artists and Nick's presentation. I'd like to underscore that in the context of an NEA product. In the little paper that we handed out, the first footnote is about the National Assessment of Educational Progress at grade 8. And they had the funding only to look at parts of music and the visual arts, even though they were charged with looking at dance, theater, music, and the visual arts. And we hear from the American Federation of Musicians, for example, about the decrease of teaching arts in the schools. That's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end, the NEA survey about public participation in the arts, I think, shows some potentially troubling trends in terms of public participation. If you don't invest at the front end, you're not going to have participation at the back end. And that seems to me something worth considering as part of the NEA message and mission.
Before lunch? Oh, yes, please.
Hi, this is as much as sort of a statement as a question, but part of the last group...
Sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Esther Robinson.
Oh, of course. Right.
What?
Can't see you.
Okay.
Great.
And I'm with an organization called Art Home, and we do asset building initiatives with individual artists. So this is sort of within that vein. One of the things that we've been seeing with individual artists is that, and it's echoed among almost all of the respondents, is this how do you deal with these multiple jobs? How do you create your life? And a lot of the questions, we're not mining enough the detail around personal financial literacy. So that there'll be questions about, do you need professional development training? Do you have access to these different kinds of trainings? But I would just flag that I'm being crushed by individuals asking for personal financial training. And that while we can't necessarily presume what professional development needs or educational needs people will need as these things become so hybridized that we can't tell what professions they're choosing, we can actually monitor and mine and respond to the individual's ability to make strong financial decisions.
Great. Oh, Angela's had her hand up one more time.
I've got a question for Stephen that's a little bit different from the questions we've had for the last few minutes.
And this will be the really last question.
Okay. You made reference in the beginning of your talk about the National Science Foundation's science and engineering indicators, which have been an incredibly powerful tool in shaping science and science education policy. And I just wonder if there's anything specific about the information they collect or the way that they use it that influenced the SNAP survey, or if you think if you think it needs to influence the way that other types of research go on in the arts.
I mean, we did look at that survey. We looked at lots of labor surveys to construct ours. We were also trying to deal with the needs of the institution. So I'd say we ended up with kind of a compromise of questions that probably don't map perfectly with the survey of earned doctorates or the survey of doctorate recipients. I think after the second round of testing, what I'd like to do is everyone in this room should look at the survey as it exists and think about whether The categories we're using can be comparable across other surveys, and if we can begin to develop some standard ways of asking questions so that the survey can be useful to compare across the arts and other fields. There's a lot of money for the survey of earned doctorates and the survey of doctorate recipients. I mean, a lot of money. If you've earned your doctorate, you will know how many different ways they get in touch with you to answer that survey. And that money is provided by the federal government through the NSF. So I don't know whether we can ever hope to have a scale of that size, but I think we should certainly aspire to having something comparable, both in terms of its value to the field and its role in policy.
Great. And with that, we'll break for lunch. I'll let you know that when we start the next session, I think some of Ann Marcus's work will really resonate with our theme here of crossover and hybridity, and we'll try to articulate some of those themes at the outset. Thanks.